Hi, everyone. This is Rajan, Anandan. Welcome to our session on the EdTech market in Southeast Asia. I hope all of you have been to Southeast Asia. For those of you that haven't been to Southeast Asia, you should definitely come to Southeast Asia. It's where everything's going on these days. Let me start. Well, firstly, I'm Rajan Anandan. I'm a partner with Sequoia Capital in India. I focus on early stage investments in India and Southeast Asia, and I've been very fortunate to be. We've been very fortunate to be investors in quite a large number of EdTech companies, both in Southeast Asia as well as in India. I'm going to start by having each of our four incredible founders introduce their companies. So we have Brian from XCL Education, Abhay, the co-founder of CoLearn, Nellie, the founder of Tigerhall, and Danny, who's from Point Avenue. So we have four amazing founders. They come from different parts, different segments of the education space in Southeast Asia. They've all got companies that are up and running, doing incredible things. And we look forward to getting their perspectives on a broad range of topics over the next 40 minutes or so. So I'm going to start with having each of them give a quick round of introduction. So Brian, maybe you could start just a minute on exactly what the company does so that the audience actually is familiar with what you guys do.
Perfect. Thanks, Rajan. And great to be here. Great to be back at the ASU+GSV Summit. Only wishing it was in person for me, but virtual it is. So I'm the founder and chief executive officer of XCL Education. We are a private schools group based out of Singapore. We focus on private brick and mortar schools throughout Southeast Asia. Today, we're the largest private schools group in Southeast Asia. We have about 30,000 students educating these students across Singapore, Malaysia, and Vietnam. And really, we focus on mainly the local schools market, Singapore being the exception, and really focus on the future of learning for K-12, so really preparing students for the jobs of tomorrow. And very excited to be here and talk about things with the group.
Great, thank you, Brian. Nellie, let's go over to you. Tell us about Tigerhall.
Yes, I'm Nellie Wartoft. I'm the founder of Tigerhall. We're a social learning platform where you can learn directly from over 800 senior business leaders and executives, and you learn from them through consumerized fun formats like podcasts, live streams, power reads, videos, and much more. So we're a B2B SaaS platform and working with large global Fortune 500 companies across Singapore, Asia Pacific, Southeast Asia, but also Australia and the US. So very glad to be here and look forward to this discussion.
Great, thank you, Nellie. Danny, let's go over to you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Danny. I'm the founder and CEO of MPX Point Avenue. It's an education technology firm headquartered in Singapore with operations in Vietnam, Thailand, along with our technology platform and team based in Korea. We recently closed our Series A fundraising, so we're moving forward on our Series B round. And we have three business verticals: K-12 schools, K-12 after schools, and then technology platforms. So a lot that we can learn from Brian and what his team has done. And I'm really glad to be a part of this. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Danny. And Abhay, over to you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Abhay. I'm one of the co-founders of CoLearn. CoLearn is a Indonesia-based K-12 EdTech player. We're focused on subjects such as maths, physics, chemistry, and English. We do two main things. One is AI-powered homework help, as well as live, interactive, highly engaging classes, which help children learn concepts. We launched in August of 2020, and at this point, we have 4 million students who signed up, making us one of the fastest growing EdTech apps in Southeast Asia. Also looking forward to the co-panelists here and the good discussion.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Abhay. Thanks, guys, for the introductions. So as we get into it, let me set the context. There may be many of you on this call that aren't as familiar with Southeast Asia. I'm hoping there are quite a number of you that are. It's a very, very exciting region, both economically as well as from a technology and internet standpoint. Southeast Asia is really a region with 10 countries, but 6 large countries. Countries that you would know would be Singapore, Indonesia, Vietnam, Thailand, Philippines, Malaysia, and then lots of other smaller countries. But really, there are 6 large countries. And across the 6 countries, there are 650 million people. So it's a large population block. It's about 400 million internet users. And last year, in fact, the region added 40 million internet users. We expect that by 2025, about 500 million or maybe 520 million out of the 650 million citizens of the region will be connected to the internet. Most countries now have pervasive broadband. If you look at time spent per user, it's among the highest in the world. In fact, a country like Thailand, Vietnam, Indonesia now are getting close to 5 hours a day per connected user on the internet. And over the last 5 to 6 years, we've seen an explosive growth in the digital economy. So we ended 2020 with the digital economy in Southeast Asia crossing $100 billion. So what's very interesting is actually the digital economy in Southeast Asia is now larger than India, despite actually being a region that's got half the population, and that's got to do with GDP per capita. And we've seen sectors like e-commerce really have explosive growth over the last 5 or 6 years. And in fact, the region's most valuable tech company, which is the C Group, SCA Group, has a market cap of $150 billion. It trades on NASDAQ. And as some of you may be familiar, Grab, which is one of the leading ride-hailing companies, will be doing a SPAC and be valued at north of 40 billion. And we've had a very large merger of two companies, Tokopedia and Gojek in Indonesia, that will also create a company that'll be valued at tens of billions of dollars when they go public. So it's a region with tremendous amounts of activity. And when it comes to education, the region's got about 3 trillion of GDP. And about over $150 billion of total spend in education. And as you'll hear in a minute, a fair bit of that actually is in private education. And what we're seeing when it comes to education and EdTech, we're seeing a lot of innovation in education. Brian and Danny will talk about that. And we're also seeing, it's still very early when you compare Southeast Asia to markets like India and China, but online education is really beginning to take off, and Abhay will talk about that. And finally, we're seeing innovation well beyond K through 12, in vocational training, in professional learning, and we're seeing some models emerge out of the region that are quite frankly, extraordinary. And Nellie will talk about how she's building a global company from Singapore, to really address those needs. So with that, let's now, I wanted to start by having each of our founders talk about how big is the market, right? So depending on, regardless of who you are, the first question you're going to ask is this big enough for us to care? And let's just hear from our founders on market sizes. So Brian, maybe you could start off and tell us a little bit about how big is the private K through 12 market in Southeast Asia?
Sure. Thanks, Rajan. Well, look, it's a really interesting time to be talking about Southeast Asia in the context of education and EdTech with the very recent regulation changes in China. The market size now becomes very interesting relative to what the new market size is for China. So in Southeast Asia today, you're looking at a private education market that's around $60 billion, of which K-12 is close to about 20 billion of that. Private brick and mortar K-12 and post-secondary is another 30 billion. So it's a very large market. And I would say if you ask me this question of its relative comparative value to China a week ago, I probably would have said, well, it's half the size. And today I would probably say it's about the same size, just given some of the regulatory changes. So I think it's an exciting place to be. It's still very early days in terms of the private education market, whether that's the segment that I focus on in K-12. There's growing penetration with more affordability, still lower quality public options, with the exception of countries like Singapore that have an exceptional public education system. So still a sizable market, still growing, boosted by great demographics and more affordability, and looking forward to diving into more detail of that with my other panelists.
Great, thank you, Brian. Danny, do you want to build on that? I know you're in a similar space, but you're obviously doing a lot of work in places like Vietnam.
Sure. So in Vietnam, fastest growing middle class population of about 100 million people. The K-12 population is about 21 million of that. So the average public education expenditure is about 4.8% of the GDP. And you can see that there's a growing number of spending from the national government on education. From 2016 to 2020, it's increased by 32%. Specifically for Thailand, so we operate in both Vietnam and Thailand, smaller population, about 70 million. K-12 population accounts for nearly 21% of that. What's interesting, however, is in the past 20 years, there's been a huge wave of Thai people moving to the cities, increasing the urban population to 51% from 31% in 2000. There are a greater number of international schools in Thailand, even with the smaller population, exceeding over 200 international schools. Whereas in Vietnam, if you look at Hanoi, there's only about 36 international schools, and Ho Chi Minh about 66 international schools. So I guess the summary here is there's a lot of growth opportunities still in Vietnam.
Terrific. Thank you, Danny. I think very exciting markets, both Vietnam and Thailand. Nellie, let's go to you, Nellie. You're in a very different space to both Brian and Danny. Tell us a little bit about how you think about how big is this market. You're obviously addressing a very large global market, but give us some context or frame it for us.
Yeah, yes, if we think of workplace learning and professional training, right? If we just look at the enterprise segment, which is also the segment that we work the most with, if you take all of the brands that you know and all the large global companies, and if we just zoom on that, you have out of the white collar population, the information workforce, you have 9% of that workforce in the US, but you have 52% of that workforce in Asia. So more than half of the world's white-collar professionals, managers, leaders are actually located in Asia. And I think what's been interesting to see is that the salaries, if you compare an individual contributor, the salaries are still higher in the US relatively. But looking at manager salaries and leader salaries, you have a much more similarity to Europe and the US to that in Asia. So it's fairly frequent in terms of like how much people are earning. And usually these companies spend between 1% to 4% of your salary on your professional development and your education. So if you take that together, then you have about 21 million people of whose salary you take 1% to 4% of that they're actually spending on professional training. So if you locate that to Southeast Asia, that's about $8 billion every year that companies are spending just on training their managers and their professional white collar workforce. So that's not even taking into account the blue collar and all the other training that people get, but just that white collar managerial training is an $8 billion market in Southeast Asia.
That's great, Nellie. That's a very large market, and as I'm sure you'll say, it's all that money is going to waste because corporate learning and development is fundamentally broken. So for those of you that are heads of HR, you should really look up, Tigerhall and what Nellie's up to. All right, Abhay, let's move to you. I mean, Indonesia is has become, an extraordinarily vibrant digital market across many segments. You look at e-commerce. Indonesia's e-commerce market is bigger than India's e-commerce market. It's growing twice as fast. But in online education, it's still very, very early days, right? So tell us a little bit about where are we when it comes to EdTech in Indonesia? How big is the market? What kinds of growth are you seeing?
Yeah, no, thanks, Rajan. I'm glad you talked about e-commerce because that was one of the thinking that we had when we started this, that we saw a lot of spend happening in Indonesia, but our thought was, how are we going to make sure that Indonesians and other folks in the area can actually earn money to be able to consume? So Indonesia, just to give everyone an idea, Indonesia is obviously the world's 4th largest country, but it is also the 4th largest education system in the world with 50 million K-12 students. But what's very different about Indonesia compared to India, China, or the United States is, unlike these other countries, Indonesia is really struggling when it comes to educational outcomes. Indonesia is in the bottom 10% of PISA. So when it comes to science, math, reading, it's been in the bottom 10% for the last 20 years, and the needle hasn't really moved. And the time is coming up for Indonesia where things really need to change very quickly if it's to be competitive on a global scale. The drivers, of the segment that we operate in, after-school tutoring, it's about a $5 billion market. Only 5% of it, which is online, but it's driven by a very different set of factors. In countries like India and China, you have tiger parents, you have hyper-competitive exams, and in Indonesia, the driver of after-school tutoring is parents who largely have not been to college and are not able to help their kids with their schoolwork, and they're just looking for either a private tutor to come to their home or an offline center that they can send their kids to. Oftentimes, though, given the geographical spread of Indonesia, 17,000 islands, oftentimes many kids are not able to access these tutoring centers that they need or a private tutor, and that's really where the role of online learning comes in.
Got it. Great. Thanks, Abhay. Let's move to the next area where we'd love to get your thoughts, and maybe Nellie, will start with you this time. Talk to us a little bit about what's changing. So, you guys, Tigerhall's playing in this $8 billion, let's call it professional learning, professional development market for large enterprises in Southeast Asia. What's changing? We'll start with you. Talk to us a little bit about what's changing.
Yeah. So the biggest change that has happened in the past, say, 5 years is the expectations of consumers and employees have drastically increased, right? They're getting exposure to lots and lots of new technologies, consumer platforms, consumer products. And if you think of where people love to spend their time, it's your Instagram, TikTok, Twitter, Spotify, it's all of those consumerized platforms, right? So you've had a very clear move where people kind of left the office on a Friday night and then they go home to their Amazons and Spotifys and all of these amazing tools. Then they come back into the office on a Monday morning. And it's like getting into a time capsule and traveling back to the 90s. And I usually say that the 90s is great for music, but not for learning platforms. So suddenly you had this like super stark contrast of, wow, like this is the kind of like products that we're having at work, like this is crap. And this is what I'm expecting as a consumer, as a user. So as we had more and more of these consumer products that have risen in the last 10 years, people's expectations on how products are behaving, how engaging they should be, all of those things have increased from a consumer point of view. And that goes into the employees as well, right? So you're not changing. It's not like you lower your expectations when you come into the workplace, rather the other way around. So when people have started using more of those products and enterprise products just haven't kept up, that's a very, very big shift that we've seen in the past 5 years. And the second thing I would say is that people have, like now talent is getting more and more in demand, which means that talent can also be more demanding. So, and this is a problem that I know is very big in the US as well, in terms of how talent is like, you can't just pay people to come over anymore, right? Like you have to attract them with other things. And this is where people look at, do I have opportunities? Do I have opportunities to learn, opportunities to grow? Is my company investing in me? These are some of the biggest areas where people are looking into when they're switching jobs. And I used to spend 4 years in recruitment. So I was leading the sales and marketing practice for Michael Page in Southeast Asia. And the number one reason that people leave is lack of learning. Like they don't learn, they don't grow, the companies can pay them more, they can offer them more days of leave. But if they're not learning, they will leave. And that's been more and more pronounced over the recent years as talent get more savvy and they demand more from their employers. So those are the top 3 changes.
Great, thanks, Nellie. Yeah, I think also maybe the other reason they leave is they get to watch these ridiculously boring training videos that learning and development teams put out that like are mind-numbingly boring. Okay, great. I'm glad you're reimagining that whole space.
The biggest problem is that they don't watch them at all.
Yeah. No, actually, I was at Google for a long time. We were mandated to watch them. Like every quarter, there'd be this thing that came out that said, "Hey, Rajan, you read on like these 5 things you haven't watched." I'm like, why would I watch this? Anyways, I'm glad you're making it very exciting. Danny, let's go to you, Danny. Talk to us about what's changing in, you talked about Vietnam and Thailand and K through 12. What are you seeing that's really changing? I mean, Vietnam's obviously exploding as an economy. Tell us about what's changing in terms of student behavior, what parents are demanding, and so forth.
Absolutely. So if I can talk specific about Vietnam, first off, parents are willing to spend up to 40% of their disposable income on their children's education, with no limitation on how many.
Danny, 40%?
40%.
That's incredible.
It is.
Wow. Okay, keep going.
Also, if you look at the current offerings in Vietnam, 90% of the market share is through offline channels, which means that there's a great deal of opportunities through online. Right now, Vietnam's $130 million EdTech market only accounts for 1% of the total education market. So when you compare with big countries like China, 45%, India, 18%, there's still a lot of growth opportunity. Now, with the pandemic, it has changed people's learning habit. Pandemic has obviously had a profound impact on online learning and shows how EdTech can definitely be a key to efficient education for all students. And so right now, I would say in Vietnam, I compare the EdTech market to an iceberg. At the top of the EdTech market in Vietnam, there are no real leaders, but underneath, there are plenty of opportunities. No sizable player yet, but definitely ample opportunities to do so.
And Danny has the online EdTech market in Vietnam, the $130 million market. Do you think it's inflected? Are you guys seeing sort of explosive growth now, or massive growth month on month, that sort of thing? Sort of what we saw in India for 2 or 3 years.
Absolutely, and I think it's just the beginning. So probably one of the biggest EdTech deals was Topica did their Series D round for about 50 million a couple years back, but there are a lot of growth opportunities here, and it will continue to grow.
And you see both growth in the offline market because the economy keeps growing, GDP per capita keeps increasing. So you're seeing growth in both the offline market, which is still 95%, as you said, as well as online, right?
Yes. So I believe the future education unicorn coming out of Vietnam would be more of a tech-enabled brick and mortar K-12 business. So not just a standalone ed tech, because I think the market is not yet ready for that, at least for the foreseeable future. So with a tech-enabled platform, right, and an existing business, I think this is a growth potential for Vietnam education companies.
Got it. Yeah. So omni-channel EdTech company. So Brian, let's go to you. What changes are you seeing? I mean, you're large offline, 30,000 students, massive presence in a bunch of these markets.
Yeah, look, it's interesting. I mean, I was listening to Danny thinking that initially I'd sort of disagreed with him, but then at the end I actually agreed with his sort of hybrid view of the future. And I guess this has kind of been exacerbated by COVID, right? I think if I talked to every single EdTech entrepreneur up to COVID, they told me that EdTech was going to replace brick and mortar learning. And what was I doing building schools? And I sort of said, okay, let's see what happens. And COVID's been interesting because it's sort of related to what we're seeing now, which is that I do think it's been an inflection point for some age groups of children and the implementation of technology in the classroom. But to some degree, let's say the implementation of home-based learning has also had quite a negative impact where depending on the age of the student and what we're seeing across our schools, we're actually embedding a lot of educational technology into not just home-based learning, but actually using it as supplementary education outside the classroom. Is when you're talking about primary school age kids, you're talking, let's say grade 6 and below, parents want them in the classroom, if nothing else, to get them out of the house. And that's been exacerbated by COVID. And they actually want less screen time when they're really young, right? They'd rather see some supplementary education that's not, with the screen. That does change when they get to be sort of secondary school and really what we would call in the US like the equivalent of high school, the last 4 grade levels. That I would say we're seeing, not a full, fledged move to online learning, but a significant amount of technology coming into the classroom. And I would say that some things that we're doing with our schools, particularly for the high school, is we're offering, digital online tutoring, one-to-one tutoring through partnerships where, we're basically having things outside the classroom where we have one-to-one tutoring in certain subjects available to students to both help them with performance and help them keep up to speed. We're also seeing a lot more opportunities, and I'm sure some of the other panelists have seen this as well, where you're starting to see online high schools. However, the interesting part about this is when you look at the growth of online high schools, it's a small market, and 80% of the students that enroll in an online high school are actually enrolling on a part-time basis, meaning that they're not really going to get a certificate or a diploma at the end, but they're using it for supplementary education. And so the thing that we're doing across our schools at the moment, and starting to implement that pretty well, is really that combination that Danny talked about, which is leveraging our massive brick and mortar base, but really bringing more value to the customer, or more value to the student by offering them enrichment opportunities digitally, either at the school or outside of the school remotely.
And then Brian, given the large number of schools that you guys have, and especially in Singapore, right? You've been in and out of lockdown. Are those schools, I mean, most of them, are the kids going into the schools still in Southeast Asia?
Yeah, it's interesting. It changes on a monthly or daily basis depending on the market. But if you look at Singapore, we've been lucky. We had a very small lockdown here. That said, there are border restrictions, as you may know, in Singapore. So we actually do have new students who are not able to relocate to Singapore, and we've created an offshore learning program that's a combination of synchronous and asynchronous classes for them to allow them to have a smoother transition. At the same time, if you look in Malaysia, Malaysia's had 3 or 4 lockdowns now. And so we're now quite used to this over the last year. At the moment, they're doing home-based learning. 2 months ago, they weren't. 3 months before that, they were doing home-based learning. Vietnam, we have a fairly significant presence in Vietnam, almost 9,000 students, and they're all, on lockdown now, but they were fortunate. We've kind of gone almost the full academic year last year of being in person, but now we're back to home-based learning.
Got it. Great. All right, let's go to Abhay. You were an offline company, and now you're entirely online. So tell us about what changes you've seen in Indonesia, in the segment that you're in, and maybe for the audience also just 30 seconds on what you were doing before, so that they have some context as well.
Yeah, I was listening to Brian and Danny thinking, hey, I used to really believe in that. But things have completely changed. I'm a total convert. Used to be an offline guy for 10 years in my previous venture. And anything to do with online, wanted to stay away from it, believed in cash flow, believed in profitability, which I still do. But I think there's a balance between scale and profitability that one has to strike. I totally believe in a hybrid world, but in a very different setting. Hybrid, at least from our view, it can mean, in the context of a student's life. So school kids, they obviously need social interaction. They need other friends to hang out with. Human beings are social beings at the end of the day. But we do see the role of school as an offline center for kids to gather and develop that side of things. But especially in a country like Indonesia, which is so spread out, there are supply issues where most kids don't have access to great tutors. Even if you graduate from some of the top universities, in the context of a sort of global setting, it's, in terms of quality, still very different. What we see is a world where, at least for online, what it solves for these kids is these physical barriers, these supply issues, and what we see, at least going forward, is, again, schools should be offline for kids, but anything to do with after-school tutoring should be online, not just because of the convenience of time and cost, but also for a lot of these kids, it's an issue of safety, where they just don't have to step out of home again. 80% of the students who come to CoLearn are actually females. And for a lot of these parents, one of their top concerns is, hey, I don't have the time to drop my kid off to an offline tutoring center. Oftentimes they will go in a cab, or they will carpool with other folks. And online also solves some of those other problems for these parents.
Thanks, Abhay. Actually, I think that's a very interesting way to think about it, right? If you think about the day on a student's life, you go to school, which is offline, which is your regular school, then you have after-school activities. Some of it will be online, some of it will be offline. And I really like what you highlighted, which is this ability to access world-class tutors, from anywhere, and then also things like safety, and I'm assuming even on cost, right? Because you don't have to spend money sort of getting to the place and getting back, and so on. So I'm glad that we're all in violent agreement that offline is not going anywhere, but at the same time, online does have a future. Actually, just all of you have mentioned COVID briefly, but any specific things that you guys have seen with COVID that are that have surprised you? Obviously, as schools shut down, everybody expected schools to go online. I'd be speaking for my daughter. She's done okay, but I think most students find it very difficult just to sit on Zoom all day and go through school. But any specific like new behaviors that we've observed, either on the student side or the teacher side, that you kind of looked and said, "Wow, I didn't expect to see that." Maybe Brian, you want to start?
Yeah, sure. It's really interesting. I think on a positive note, I guess I'd start on a positive note. I do think that, particularly, for teachers, change is always a challenge. And I think, seeing some of their ability to rally very rapidly at the beginning of the pandemic to online, when a lot of teachers really aren't used to, presenting online. It's a very different stylistic pedagogical approach. So I think one of the things I was pleased about was to see, how many of our staff were really able to almost turn on a dime, do something that was completely outside their comfort zone, and deliver lessons to the best of their ability to students who were, struggling. So that I think was, really remarkable, seeing that with teachers' ability to do that. At the same time, I do think, whether it's Zoom or pick whatever your platform is, I think there's a lot of burnout. And I think what we've seen as it's dragged on a bit longer, maybe more on the negative side, is that whole social and emotional side of things, whether that's for students interacting, to Abhay's point, students do want to, interact. They human beings are like that social interaction. But the same thing applies to staff, right? Not having, the ability to see your colleague, in the hallway, have a conversation, meet with a few other teachers to talk about students. You just really can't do that stuff virtually. And so I think what's come out of this, though, are some really interesting tools and some, one of the things I'm fascinated with and I'm starting to see is, you're starting to see social emotional educational technology platforms where, whether it's wellness or mindfulness, and platforms that allow particularly teachers and others to really get together, share some of their thoughts. So it's been a challenge, but I would say seeing how people have risen to the occasion of doing something that's far outside their comfort zone has been very, very encouraging.
That's great. Thanks, Brian. Actually, maybe combining this with another question that I had, Nellie, are you seeing companies becoming more open to sort of reimagining their learning and development platforms? Obviously, there are lots of people working from home, so how do you keep them engaged, inspired? And also, the other question I'd love for you to answer in addition to that is, you're building a global company, right? Doesn't matter whether you're a company or an employee in the US or Latin America or Africa or China. Tell us about building EdTech, or in your case, professional learning type company from Singapore focused on the world. Maybe you can answer both of those, changes in behavior as well as is this a real thing, right? Can we expect, much like in India, we've seen this massive wave of India to the world SaaS companies. Can we see a set of EdTech companies that come from Southeast Asia building for the world?
Yeah. So starting with the first question on what are the changes we've seen, I think this has been really interesting that the concept of digital has massively expanded. And this is where I think K-12 lags quite behind, because K-12 is still a lot of videos, it's a lot of Zoom. And that's what we saw in professional education in the first 3-4 months of COVID. So then it was like, we have to put everything on Zoom, we have to put all the trainers in, all our classroom, we have to just put the trainer on Zoom and everything will be fine. And they did that for 3 to 4 months and then realized people are falling asleep, people are skipping it, people are bored out of their minds, people are getting exhausted, burnt out, etc. So I think what was interesting is when we saw this move from, we can't just have trainers online, but how can we engage our employees in learning in different ways that doesn't ask them to sit more hours in front of Zoom than they already are? Because we're all tired of our laptop screens, right? Like our laptops is like a love-hate relationship. We don't want to spend more time with them necessarily. So what we've seen is this massive increase in podcasts and live streams and things that do not necessarily have you sitting in front of your laptop screen. So on Tigerhall, we have our learners spend on average 43 minutes every week on the platform, and some of them even 1 hour, 2 hour, 3 hours on learning every week. If you would ask them to spend the time on a Zoom training session, all of them would say no. But the reason that they can do that is that they can do that when they're doing something else, taking the dog for a walk, in the shower is the second most common use case, cooking food, etc. So I think the biggest change that we've seen is this expansion of the concept of digital, and just realizing that we can't just put trainers on Zoom because that's not engaging anyone, and hence starting to experiment with audio and with different things that doesn't require sitting in front of your laptop and watching videos. So I think that's the biggest change when it comes to what we've seen in COVID. On your second question, Rajan, on building global for the world, I think it's very, very possible to build a global company from Southeast Asia. And we've seen that with companies like Razer, for example, the gaming company, which is a great example of a Singaporean company that is now dual headquartered in the US and in Singapore. And I think one of the benefits of building from this part of the world is a little bit like, I'm from Sweden originally, and if you want to do anything in the world, you can't speak Swedish, right? You have to learn English because that's the language that the world speaks. So similarly, if you're building a company in Singapore, you can't build for Singapore because Singapore is too small. So very early on in your journey, you learn to understand other markets, other nuances, other regions, other types of customer preferences and consumer behaviors. So you get that on very early on in your journey, as opposed to if you're building in the US for the US, you can build a fairly large company just focusing on the US. But in Southeast Asia, or in Singapore at least, you can't. So quite early on, you get an understanding for different languages, different cultures, different ways of interacting with your product, and so on. And I think that's a massive advantage when you're building a global company. So, and it's a very, very diverse region, right? And then the other advantage that you have in Singapore in particular is selling into global headquarters and APAC headquarters. They're based out of Singapore, which allows you to reach a very, very large part of the region, a very large part of APAC, again, very early on in your journey. And then you don't have the same kind of talent scarcity and expensive talent and so on, like you do in the US. So you can also build a really good team, but still sell to global clients. And that's how we've reached many of our clients in the US. We've started working with them in Asia, and then they see the success here, and then we introduce it to Europe and then to the US, and that's how it's growing globally in these large global enterprises. So you have many of those advantages from very early on in your journey, which I think makes it a very strong region to build large global companies from as well.
That's great. Thank you, Nellie. Okay, we have only a couple of minutes left, so let's go to challenges. So clearly, Southeast Asia, a very large education market, lots of exciting trends, lots of interesting companies getting built. What are the challenges? You know, we've been reading about what's going on in China. Maybe Danny, we can speak. Start with you since you're in Vietnam and Thailand. What are some of the challenges? What do you worry about?
Sure. So I think with the recent changes in China, especially the tutoring schools going nonprofit and foreign investors having to exit, there seems to be somewhat of a negative sentiment about the education and the impact that it could have within the region. However, generally, I'm quite optimistic, right, that the policies impacted in China will definitely not take into effect in Vietnam across the region in Southeast Asia. I think, of course, there are a lot of challenges, right? Specifically, the growth potential, as we've explained earlier, is in the brick and mortar as well as in the EdTech. But some of the major challenges with EdTech is the time required for systematic and curriculum transition. Within the K-12 space, especially, there's a lot of hesitation from teachers and lecturers to engage in online education delivery. And of course, COVID has only accelerated that. There's broadly a low-level perception of value or status of online education from the decision makers for K-12, who are generally parents, and lack of evidence or market willingness to pay for online courses, right? So monetizing, gaining user base is one thing, but being able to monetize is a bit of a challenge. And then the need for greater quality assurance in online education. So yeah, these are challenges in emerging markets. Of course, there are some great companies currently who are tackling those challenges. But generally very optimistic about the future of Vietnam, Thailand, and Southeast Asia.
That's great. Thanks. Thanks, Nellie. Good to hear that Vietnam's not going to change their education policies. And also, I completely agree with you. I think, in EdTech, I think the big question is, what can you get paid for and how much can you get paid, right? Abhay, what challenges do you see? I mean, you're building this explosive, positively explosive, a rapidly growing EdTech company. What challenges do you see in Indonesia?
I think in Indonesia specifically, one of the main challenges is getting people to see education as a investment and not as an expense. That's broadly the approach, the thought process that most parents have. Secondly, like Danny said, it's the same issue in Indonesia, online fatigue. Kids have been, parents see their kids napping or playing video games, and generally their perception of what online learning is tends to become a very negative one. But with that, we also see opportunities because Indonesia is, it's sort of a critical time for Indonesia. Not only is it in the bottom 10% of PISA, but it's projected that because of COVID, rankings are actually going to go down further. And so people realize that something needs to change. And most people also realize, given the situation with COVID, which is happening, unfortunately, people see schools, face-to-face schools getting extended, not happening for another few months. And the only solution that parents can now see is online. And so I think the opportunity for us and for other players is, how can you make sure that you differentiate yourself and you provide an online learning experience which parents and students both feel good about?
That's great. Thanks, Abhay. That pretty much brings us to a close, guys. So firstly, I want to thank our four extraordinary panelists. Excited to hear about all the companies that each of you are building. And for those of you that, of course, if you're attending this, you have an interest in Southeast Asia. As Brian aptly put it, this is a region that's got only 650 million people. But as of this week, has an education market that is addressable for entrepreneurs that is as large as China. And as you can see, it's still early days. Massive set of opportunities to innovate across the spectrum, K through 12, after school, higher ed, professional training, and it's still day zero in Southeast Asia. Thanks everyone for joining us, and thank you to our awesome founders.